These cases didn't just haunt the victims, they broke the detectives assigned to stop them. Not because the crimes were unsolved, but because solving them came at a cost no one warned them about. 5 investigations, 5 crimes so disturbing that seasoned officers needed counseling. This isn't rumor, these are real cases documented in court records and police files. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of the job is understanding what another human being is capable of. This is Unimaginable True Crimes, and these are the cases that never truly ended. Case number 1, BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. Perpetrator, Dennis Rader. Location, Wichita, USA. There are cases that break rules, and then there are cases that break people. The BTK investigation didn't just exhaust detectives, it hollowed them out. It rewired how they slept, how they trusted silence, how they understood evil. For decades, officers chased a ghost who didn't just kill, he communicated, mocked, and waited. And the worst part? He looked like everyone else. Wichita, Kansas was not built for nightmares. It was a city of quiet streets, modest homes, church picnics, and predictable routines. When the first murders occurred in 1974, police believed they were dealing with a burglary gone wrong. Then came the letter. It arrived at the local newspaper, typed, deliberate, smug. Inside, the writer described murders that only the killer could know. He signed it with 3 letters that would become infamous. BTK. Bind, Torture, Kill. From that moment on, the case stopped being a murder investigation. It became psychological warfare. BTK didn't kill out of rage. He killed with ritual. He stalked families for weeks, sometimes months. He watched routines. He memorized floor plans. He fantasized long before he ever touched a door handle. When he entered homes, he often pretended to be a wanted criminal in need of food or money. Once inside, he restrained entire families, parents forced to watch as their children were murdered first. Detectives later said the crime scenes were emotionally radioactive. Veteran officers vomited, some cried, others went numb, and BTK wanted them to feel every second of it. After killings, BTK wrote, not to confess, but to control. He criticized police methods. He complained when media coverage faded. He demanded recognition like an artist starved of praise. He included drawings, poems, word puzzles. Each letter forced detectives to relive scenes they were trying desperately to forget. Some officers began to dread mail delivery more than crime scenes. This wasn't a case that allowed closure. Years passed without arrests. Detectives aged, retired, died. New officers inherited boxes of evidence and decades of failure. Every told lead felt like reopening a wound. Several investigators later admitted they sought counseling, not because of a single crime, but because of the relentless intimacy of BTK's cruelty. He wanted to be known, and he succeeded. Dennis Rader wasn't hiding in shadows. He was a church leader, a Cub Scout president, a city compliance officer. He enforced neighborhood rules. He smiled. He raised children. And while living that life, he fantasized about murder almost daily. Detectives would later say this was the detail that haunted them most. Not the gore, the normalcy. BTK stopped killing in the early 1990s. Police believed he had died, been imprisoned, or moved away. Then, after nearly 30 years, he resurfaced, older, arrogant. He began writing again, and in a moment of devastating irony, he asked police a question. "Can I communicate with floppy disks?" Detectives answered, lying that it was safe. It wasn't. Metadata on the disk led them straight to a church computer, and then to Dennis Rader. When Rader was arrested in 2005, detectives felt relief and something darker, because the monster they had built in their minds was just a man who had lived freely while they carried his crimes home with them every night. Some officers cried in the interrogation room, others stared silently. Justice came, but late, because BTK wasn't chaos, he was patience weaponized. And he taught law enforcement something terrifying. Evil doesn't always erupt. Sometimes it waits.
Case number 2, the murder of Junko Furuta. Victim, Junko Furuta. Location, Tokyo, Japan. Some cases traumatize detectives because of what they see. This one traumatized them because of what didn't happen. No rescue, no interruption, no moment where someone stepped in and stopped it. The murder of Junko Furuta became one of the most disturbing cases in modern criminal history, not only for its cruelty, but for the suffocating truth at its center. This crime unfolded slowly, in plain sight, while the world looked away. Junko Furuta was 17 years old. She lived in Tokyo, went to school, worked part-time, and had plans that were entirely ordinary: graduation, independence, adulthood. She was described as polite, hard-working, and kind. Teachers trusted her, employers relied on her. She had no criminal ties, no risky lifestyle, no warning signs, which is why what happened next shattered every illusion investigators had about safety. In late 1988, Junko was abducted by a group of teenage boys, some connected to local delinquent gangs. They threatened her family, convinced her escape would lead to worse consequences, and took her to a house in Tokyo. At first, police believed the crime would follow familiar patterns. They were wrong. What followed was not impulsive violence, it was systematic dehumanization. Junko was held captive for over 40 days inside a normal residential home. Neighbors heard noises, visitors came and went, family members of the perpetrators were present. No one called police. Detectives would later struggle with this reality more than any single act of violence. The crime required collective silence. When police finally discovered what had happened, even veteran detectives were unprepared. Investigators later described reading statements and forensic reports in shifts, not because of workload, but because exposure needed to be limited. Some officers requested reassignment, others sought psychological counseling for the first time in their careers. The case notes were described as unfit for continuous review, not because of gore, but because of duration. Cruelty stretched across weeks changes how the brain processes horror. Many violent crimes are explosive, brief, chaotic, over quickly. This one was slow. Junko endured sustained abuse that escalated day by day. Each failure to intervene emboldened the perpetrators further. Each ignored sign reinforced the belief that no one was coming. Detectives later admitted the hardest part wasn't cataloging the acts, it was imagining the waiting, the nights, the hours, the hope that never arrived. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was not the perpetrators themselves, but the ecosystem around them. People suspected something was wrong. People noticed inconsistencies. People heard her cries. But fear, denial, and social pressure kept doors closed. For investigators, this created a secondary trauma, confronting how ordinary human hesitation can enable extraordinary evil. When arrests were finally made, the public response in Japan was explosive.
Court proceedings were emotional and tense. Many felt the sentences were too lenient given the severity of the crime. The case sparked nationwide debates about juvenile justice, sentencing laws, and societal responsibility. Detectives who worked the case testified years later that the trial did not bring closure. Justice, while necessary, felt incomplete. Because this case forced them to confront questions no badge prepares you for. How many people knew and chose silence? How does cruelty grow when unchecked? What happens when evil isn't hidden, but ignored? For many officers, the Furuta case permanently altered how they viewed community, responsibility, and intervention. It taught them that the most dangerous crimes aren't always secret. Sometimes they're tolerated. Junko Furuta became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of failure. Failure to protect, failure to act, failure to believe that someone else would step in. Detectives carried that weight long after the case closed. Some never put it down.
Case number 3, the Green River Killer. Perpetrator, Gary Ridgway. Location, Seattle metropolitan area, USA. Some investigations explode into life and end in a burst of arrests, trials, and verdicts. This one lingered. It seeped into offices, marriages, sleep, and sanity. The Green River Killer case didn't traumatize detectives because of a single horrifying moment. It did so because it never seemed to stop. And every time officers believed it was over, another body surfaced. In the early 1980s, bodies began appearing along the Green River near Seattle. Young women, often marginalized, often dismissed by society before they ever vanished. At first, the deaths were treated individually, tragic, isolated, unconnected. Then the similarities became impossible to ignore. Detectives realized they weren't chasing a suspect, they were chasing time. The task force grew quickly, eventually becoming one of the largest serial killer investigations in U.S. history. Detectives worked 16-hour days. They revisited the same locations repeatedly. They interviewed thousands, and every new lead carried the same unspoken fear. If we don't move fast enough, someone else will die. That pressure does things to people. Unlike killers who crave attention, the Green River Killer was silent. No letters, no taunts, no confessions, just absence. Detectives had nothing to react to, only patterns and probability. They built profiles, tracked movements, analyzed victimology, and still, the killings continued. Officers later said the worst moments weren't the crime scenes, they were the days between them. One suspect surfaced early, Gary Ridgway. He failed a polygraph. Witnesses placed him with victims. Evidence raised red flags, but nothing stuck, and so he walked free. For detectives, that knowledge became corrosive. Every time a body was discovered, they wondered if the killer had been standing right in front of them all along. Some of them were right. As years passed, detectives rotated out, not because of failure, but because the case demanded too much. Some developed anxiety disorders, others reported nightmares. Several sought counseling after realizing how deeply the work had embedded itself in their personal lives. One investigator would later say, "You don't clock out of a case like that. It lives with you." In the late 1990s, forensic technology advanced. DNA analysis reopened doors that had long been sealed. Evidence collected years earlier was retested. In 2001, the results pointed unmistakably back to Gary Ridgway, the same man detectives had questioned decades earlier. The arrest brought relief, but also rage. Ridgway eventually confessed to dozens of murders, far more than investigators had been able to confirm. He spoke plainly, without emotion, without hesitation. For detectives, the confessions were a double-edged sword. They finally had answers, but they also had to hear, again and again, what they had spent years trying not to imagine. Several officers stepped away from law enforcement entirely after the case closed, because the Green River Killer case wasn't just about death, it was about systemic neglect, victims ignored, warnings missed, years lost. Detectives carried guilt not because they didn't care, but because they cared and still couldn't stop it sooner. That weight doesn't disappear with an arrest. It forced departments nationwide to rethink how missing persons are prioritized, how marginalized victims are treated, how long-term exposure to violence affects investigators. The case changed protocols and people, because the Green River Killer wasn't a mystery solved by brilliance or luck, it was solved by time. And time, in cases like this, is paid for in lives. Case number 4, the Toolbox Killers. Perpetrators Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. Location, Southern California, USA.
Some crimes end when the killer is caught. This one didn't. For detectives who worked the Toolbox Killers case, the violence followed them home, not as memories, but as sound. It replayed in their minds while driving, while trying to sleep, while sitting silently with their families. Because this wasn't just a case built on crime scenes and evidence, it was built on recordings, and once you hear them, you never truly stop listening. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris did not meet by chance. They found each other through shared impulses, fantasies that revolved around control, domination, and pain. Their bond wasn't fueled by rage or desperation, it was fueled by planning. Together, they built a routine. They abducted young women. They transported them to isolated areas. They documented what they did, not for proof, for pleasure. During the investigation, detectives recovered an audio tape recorded by the killers. It captured hours of a victim's suffering. Investigators were required to listen, to identify voices, details, patterns. Some detectives vomited, some broke down in tears, others went silent, refusing to speak for hours. The tape was later used in court, not played aloud, but described. Even those descriptions were enough to leave jurors shaken. The FBI would later use the tape as a training tool, not to study the killers, but to prepare agents for the psychological toll of extreme cases. Because this wasn't violence you could compartmentalize. There were no quick scenes, no sudden acts, no distance. The recordings forced detectives to experience the crime in real time, over and over again. Several investigators later reported PTSD symptoms. One officer requested reassignment and never returned to homicide work. Another described the tape as a door you open once and can't close. When Bittaker and Norris were arrested, evidence was overwhelming. The trial was swift but emotionally brutal. Prosecutors made deliberate choices to minimize harm, limiting exposure, avoiding unnecessary detail. Still, the courtroom carried a weight unlike anything many had experienced. Bittaker showed no remorse. Norris eventually testified, but his words offered little relief. Justice arrived in sentences. Healing did not. Many serial killers leave behind letters, patterns, or confessions. The Toolbox Killers left behind voices, and sound has a way of bypassing defenses. It embeds itself. Detectives didn't just investigate this case, they absorbed it. This case permanently changed how agencies handle extreme evidence. Mandatory counseling protocols, rotations for exposure-heavy material, psychological screening for long-term cases. Because some evidence doesn't just inform, it wounds. Not to shock, but to explain why mental health support for investigators isn't optional, it's survival. Because some crimes don't end with arrests. They echo.
Case number 5, the Kansas City Butcher. Perpetrator, Robert Berdella. Location, Kansas City, USA. Some cases traumatize investigators during the hunt. This one traumatized them after the hunt was over. Robert Berdella was already arrested when detectives finally understood the full scope of what he had done. The danger had ended. The suspect was contained. There would be no more victims. And yet, this was the case that sent seasoned detectives to counseling weeks after the arrest, because the truth didn't come from witnesses. It came from what Berdella left behind. To neighbors, Robert Berdella was eccentric, but harmless. He owned an antique shop. He hosted dinner parties. He spoke politely, intelligently, and at length about philosophy, politics, and art. People described him as odd, not threatening. Police had no reason to watch him, until one man escaped. In April 1988, a young man fled Berdella's home, injured, terrified, and barely able to speak. He collapsed outside and told authorities what had been done to him. When police entered Berdella's house, they expected to confirm an assault. They did not expect to uncover a private archive of cruelty. Berdella's home was meticulously organized. Too organized. Investigators discovered photographs, journals, and detailed notes documenting acts committed against multiple victims. Dates, times, reactions, measurements. There was no chaos. There was cataloging. Detectives would later say this precision was what broke them. It wasn't rage or desperation. It was methodical curiosity, as if human suffering were an experiment. Unlike most cases, the most disturbing material wasn't physical remains, it was documentation. Photos captured moments investigators could not forget. Journals described actions with clinical detachment. Some officers refused to review entire sections without supervision. Counselors were brought in, not because the material was graphic alone, but because of its intimacy. Berdella had recorded not just what he did, but how it made others feel. That detail haunted detectives. Berdella confessed quickly. He did not resist. He did not minimize. He did not apologize. His tone was analytical, detached. He spoke as though describing a process rather than crimes. For investigators, this created a secondary trauma, reconciling the horror of the acts with the calm of the man describing them. Police departments learned a painful lesson from this case. Some evidence is not meant to be consumed without protection. Detectives who reviewed Berdella's materials reported nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and emotional withdrawal. Several took extended leave. This wasn't weakness, it was exposure. After Berdella, departments nationwide revised how extreme evidence is handled. Rotational review teams, mental health debriefs, limited exposure schedules. Because the job doesn't end when the suspect is arrested. Sometimes it begins when the truth surfaces. Because it proves something unsettling. You don't have to witness violence to be damaged by it. Understanding it can be enough. Detectives weren't traumatized by chasing Berdella. They were traumatized by knowing him. BTK taunted. Faruta was abandoned. Green River never ended. Toolbox killers recorded. Berdella documented. Different crimes, same outcome. Human minds stretched beyond what they were meant to carry. Should investigators be required to review every piece of evidence personally? How do you balance justice with psychological safety for law enforcement? Does documenting violence make it more damaging than committing it impulsively?
How much exposure is too much for anyone? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If these series challenged you, not with shock, but with truth, like this video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, turn on notifications for our next deep investigation. These stories matter because they reveal what evil leaves behind, not just for victims, but for those who must confront it. If these cases disturbed you, the next one goes even further. In our next episode, detectives revisit a crime everyone thought was solved, until one forgotten detail reopened everything. Watch the next investigation on your screen now.